Let's turn to the two passages that specifically refer to Jesus.
Yeah.
So in Book 20,
Yeah.
he's talking about the high priest in Jerusalem,
Yes.
Ananus.
Yeah.
And he tells us that Ananus convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them over to be stoned.
Yes.
What's the value of that text?
Everything about that text rings true in terms of what we know about Ananus and what we know about James as well, that he was the leading figure of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem at that time. And the other evidence we have from the New Testament and other early Christian sources precisely supports this story that James had a violent death at the hands of the Jewish authorities, and that this was because of his leadership of the Christian movement. So the general outline of that story is absolutely fits everything else that we know.
Some would dispute, some popular writers anyway, have disputed that Josephus would ever have said, the brother of Jesus called Christ.
Well, it's the way Josephus says there, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, who's also called Christ. In other words, Josephus is not committing himself to the messiahship of Jesus. But he's saying this is something that people say about him, and that rings true. If that comment had been made by a Christian, it wouldn't have been the so-called Christ. It would have been James, the brother of Jesus, who is the Christ.
Do most scholars today, whether Jewish, Christian or otherwise, who are experts in this area, agree that this passage at least has come from the pen of Josephus?
Yes, most people would say that. Obviously, that phrase about the so-called Christ is the most disputed, and there are some who would question that. But most scholars would accept that whole passage is authentic to Josephus.
Okay, which brings us to the more controversial one, where there's lots of discussion. I'll just read a little bit of it. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of people who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had him condemned to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. It then goes on to talk about him being raised to life and the tribe of Christians still existing today. Can you tell us what's the general consensus of scholarship on the passage broadly viewed? The
general consensus at the moment is that there are elements of that passage that have probably been added in by Christian copyists, but that most of the passage, or the core of the passage, is authentic to Josephus. In other words, that he did refer to Jesus, and he is quite complimentary about Jesus, and he refers to how Jesus was killed, but that some of those statements have probably been touched up by Christians. Now, the reason why that is possible is because Josephus his manuscripts were handed down in the Christian community more than in the Jewish community. Josephus's reputation never really recovered after his involvement in the war, and although he wrote in defense of Jews, Jews never really fully owned him. But Christians leapt on his work because it was really useful for them to understand the background and the history of their own movement. And so his texts were normally handed on, as it were, in Christian circles.
Some would therefore say, well, that makes the whole thing suspicious. If we're confident there are some interpolations, like if one indeed could call him a man, then surely the whole thing is suspicious.
One can take that radical option, but more careful historians are prepared to say, rather than inventing the whole passage wholesale, if Christians had invented the whole passage wholesale, there's lots of things there that they wouldn't have said. They wouldn't have said Jesus was a wise man. They wouldn't have started off with this very sort of modest statement about him. They would have put in much more detail from the Gospels in order to expand this paragraph.
Well, and there would be a mistake, therefore, because it says he won over Greeks, and every Gospel reader knew he didn't.
Exactly. So there are things about this that just wouldn't ring true as Christian statements. There are other things like he was the Messiah, or if one can call him a man, which look very much like Christians were adding in some phrases to try and bump this up. But so the whole thing gives the impression of an authentic base, which has been touched up, as it were, but not created wholesale by Christians.
This touches on a topic that I know will sound bizarre to even ask the question, but in some popular circles, increasingly, people question that there ever was an historical figure, Jesus. And so they say this is just a forgery, everything's a forgery. Can that be taken seriously in a scholarly context?
No. All proper classical historians are quite prepared to say that Jesus existed. There's not only the evidence of Josephus, there's Tacitus evidence as well, and there's the evidence of the Christian movement itself. It's impossible to explain how this thing could come about out of absolutely nothing and completely create the story of Jesus out of nothing. So there's no, as far as I'm aware, no serious classical historian who would say that Jesus is a complete fiction. They're quite prepared to admit, as it were, to say that there are passages like this which are difficult to handle, but that Josephus could be talking about Jesus is absolutely no problem, considering that Josephus talks about lots of figures and just touches on them in the history of early Judaism.
Can I ask for just a hunch on your part? Where did Josephus get his information about Jesus? Do you think it was later in Rome, or could it have been when he was in Galilee himself for a year?
Probably while he was in Rome. It's hard to know how the Christian movement took root in Galilee after the resurrection of Jesus, and whereas we do know there was a substantial Christian community in Rome, on the edges of the synagogues there. Josephus was probably involved with the Jewish community in Rome and would have come across these people who were beginning to be known in his day as Christians, and that's why he refers to them as the tribe of Christians, which was a negative term applied to them. It wasn't their own term, but it was a negative term applied to them. And already at the time of Nero in 64, Christians were beginning to be singled out and separated out from Jews by the Roman authorities. Josephus is in Rome just a few years after that and knows about these Christians and their tenacity in their loyalty to Jesus.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, you're very welcome.